Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, Paul, Nicolau, Your Eminence, Your Excellency, the Ambassador of the United States in Australia, Premier, and most importantly of all, Arthur and Elizabeth Sinodinos. Can I say that tonight is a nice opportunity for me to say just a few words about somebody who played a fundamentally important role in the success of an outstanding government that I had the privilege of leading. I've never believed in the one-man band theory of politics. The really successful governments are teams, they're partnerships, they're combinations of men and women holding different positions, not only at the elected level but also at the staff level. And I had in Arthur Sinodinos somebody who really matched all of the challenges that are needed in a chief of staff role. To start with, he was highly intelligent. He was a very good economist. I think like the rest of the good economists, he'd be completely baffled at the way in which all the economic paradigms have changed over the last few years. Like many others, he joined the search party for the Phillips curve that seems to have gone missing. You know, the link between unemployment and inflation. I mean, we've got this extraordinary situation now where we have record low interest rates. I mean, I think they've been driven too low, but I don't want to create any ripples on that subject. We have record low interest rates. We have achieved the nirvana of 20 years ago, and that is that we have low unemployment, but we don't have wages growth. I can remember the very first treasurer. He was a Labor treasurer, but he was a very nice man, Frank Green. He's the first person to deliver a budget in the parliament I joined in 1974, and he used to plead with people not to have excessive wage increases. He said that one man's wage rise was another man's job. And we all believed that then, but somehow or other that's fallen by the wayside. But I'm sure Arthur has got an explanation for that. But like many other economists, he was baffled by it. But he was a great economist. He was a person who always had his feet on the ground. Arthur, to me, was a wonderful example of a completely bicultural man. He was as Australian as the gum tree, but he was very proud of his Greek heritage. He was very proud of his association with the Greek Orthodox Church. He was admired in the Australian Greek community. And Paul said about 70% of you are of Greek heritage. Well, I'm not part of that 70%, but I can say this. I was born in Earlwood. Wait for it, my wife was born in Kingsford. Now, that is about the next best thing to being Greek in Sydney, isn't it? But he's very proud of it, and we admire many things about Arthur. We admire his intelligence. We admire his fidelity to the political party of his choice. We admire the professionalism of his service as a Chief of Staff, and we admire the extraordinary courage that he displayed in the face of a terrible illness, and he was sustained in that by the love of his family and his deep Orthodox faith. A successful Chief of Staff is somebody who not only enjoys the confidence of the person for whom he works, but also has the confidence of those two constellations of men and women with whom a Prime Minister interacts. One of those constellations is the parliamentary party and the members of the cabinet, and the other constellation is the public service. And a really effective Chief of Staff is somebody to whom a minister can talk in confidence in a relaxed and trustworthy fashion, who listens to the minister respectfully, but also in a way that is helpful to the minister's understanding. And also somebody who develops and maintains a very close link between the Prime Minister's office and, by definition, the office of other ministers and the public service. The public service is a great asset, and any successful government uses a public service intelligently. You don't always take the advice of the public service, but you should always respect it and listen to it. And when you don't take their advice, you tell them why. And Arthur had a great capacity, largely, but not only because he came out of the public service, of understanding that and having that respect. And I know that one of the secrets of the success of the government I led was that we did have good links, the most of the time, with our professional advisors. We didn't always take their advice, neither we should have. But we know in the main it was very well intended. And Arthur was always at the forefront of saying, please tell the public service why you're not taking their advice, because it means that you will continue to retain their confidence. Arthur also had very good links with the Australian business community, and that's very important for a pro-capitalist, free enterprise government. You must have links with business. Never forget that at the end of the day, the side of politics that Arthur and I belong to is the side of politics that believes in capitalism, believes in risk-taking, and believes in the success of business. And I remember vividly one illustration of Arthur's capacity to interact with the business community. We all remember the terrible events of September 2001. As all of you know, I was in Washington at the time and had met in the first time in his capacity as President George W. Bush, the day before the terrible attack on New York and Washington. But back in Australia at that time, there was unfolding the collapse of Ansett Airlines, which was a major domestic economic development. And when I returned to Australia, one of our biggest challenges was to fill the gaps left by the withdrawal of air services provided by Ansett. And that of necessity involved Qantas providing additional services, additional planes and the like. And I was constantly for several days, one after the other, on the phone to Margaret Jackson, who was then the chairman of Qantas. And on a couple of occasions, she couldn't reach me. I was at a cabinet meeting. When I caught up with her later on, I apologised for the fact that I couldn't return all of her phone calls. And she said, don't worry, I spoke to Arthur. And you know, he's just the right person to deal with, because he knows what he can say on your behalf, and he also knows what he can't say on your behalf. And he said she said the best people in those positions are those who know the extent of their authority, but also know the limits of that authority. And she said he was able to say to me, look, you can do this and this and this, but as for that, that's one for the boss to decide. I'll have to ask him about that. And she said, I was never left in any doubt as to where our company stood and what was expected of and what was required of it. Now that is an absolutely wonderful capacity. I'm very fond of Arthur. He remains a dear friend of mine. He could make me laugh. He had a great sense of humour. And sometimes in a Prime Minister's office you need a Chief of Staff who can make the Prime Minister laugh. Because sometimes there are a lot of things that, might make you want to cry rather than laugh. But he had that great laconic capacity to cut through. And if Arthur wanted to dismiss an argument in a group of people, he could do it very well. But he was very respectful to the other staff. He was very respectful to my staff. and he won their affection and their admiration. So he goes to the United States as our plenipotentiary with great goodwill, and I know that he will build on the relationship. Each ambassador, in my experience, that we've sent to the United States has made a huge contribution. Each is different. Arthur will do it quite differently from Joe Hockey, as Joe Hockey did it very differently from Kim Beazley, who did a terrific job as our ambassador. And Beazley did it differently from Dennis Richardson, who did a magnificent job, and Michael Thorley, and so I can go way back. They were all outstanding. But in undertaking this role, he's building on a treasured relationship. The values that bind Australia and the United States together are values that all of us hold very dear. And in the end, links between nations built on values are far more important than links between nations built on economics. The economics are important, but the values are even more important. And those values are instantly recognisable before any Australian or any American audience. And I know in my experience, when the United States was under attack from terrorism, when we together responded to that, how important those common bonds and those common values were. And when I had the privilege in 2006 in 2003 rather, of addressing a joint sitting of Congress, it was the common values of Australians and Americans that I stressed. So Arthur will go to the United States with our very best wishes, our blessings. It's quite a nice house that he will be living in Washington. But most importantly of all, he will go in the name of 25 million Australians who have a deep and abiding affection for the people of the United States of America. Thank you.
Take you back to your seat.
Yeah.
Friends, please stand and give the Prime Minister, the ex-former Prime Minister, a standing ovation. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Thank you very much, Mr. Howard. We love you and will continue to love you. And thank you very much for all the work that you've done as Prime Minister, and even after being Prime Minister, the work that you do.